Why must there always be a Stark in Winterfell? It's a phrase that keeps on cropping up in A Song of Ice and Fire, but why? Is there something magic going on? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek, particularly if you're here for the first time. Welcome. This is the first in a series of videos about the Starks and their centrality to the plot of A Song of Ice and Fire. 7 of the first 8 chapters of Book 1 are from the Starks' perspective, and over 70% of all of A Game of Thrones. We know they are central to the plot, but how? Why did George R. R. Martin decide to make them the people we should sympathise with at the start of this story? Because he surely does want to make us sympathise with them. I'm sure there are a lot of answers to that, and we'll try to cover them all in this series, but let's start by focusing in on their link to Winterfell and the many secrets that lie there. In particular this time, why must there always be a Stark at Winterfell? Well, we should acknowledge that there is definitely a practical benefit of the saying to the Starks. It adds legitimacy to their rule. The Starks didn't just rule from Winterfell because they always have or because they have a big army. No, they must be there for vague historical or possibly even magical reasons. The North is built on tradition, and the Starks being in Winterfell is one of the central parts of that. So I'm sure the Starks were happy to keep on repeating the phrase to support their rule. But crucially, the saying also ties the Starks to the castle. They couldn't move to a bigger or cooler or better situated castle, for example. As far as we can tell, until Bran and Rickon fled Winterfell at the end of A Clash of Kings, there had been a Stark in Winterfell without break for millennia. This sometimes had amusing or consequential implications for the Starks, trying to juggle their family members amid various crises so as to ensure there was always a Stark in Winterfell. For example, Lord Rickard Stark sent all his children to the tourney at Harrenhal, but himself stayed in Winterfell until Benjen returned all the way north to tag-team him in, so to speak, so he could then head south for Brandon's planned wedding. And then Benjen had to stay in Winterfell throughout the entirety of Robert's rebellion until Ned returned, when he could then safely leave to join the Night's Watch. So let's take the reasonable starting position that this saying is there to ensure that the Starks both remain in power and remain in Winterfell. Why? Well, let's dig into the history a bit. Winterfell has been the home of the Starks for perhaps 8,000 years. In fact, for as long as House Stark has existed. This timing is crucial because it means that it was built at about the same time as the Wall by Bran the Builder, who was the founding father of House Stark. In other words, the founding of the Stark dynasty is connected inextricably with both the building of Winterfell and the defeat of the White Walkers the first time around, or more precisely, the defences built against their return. Hold on to that thought, we'll come back to it a few times in the next few videos. House Stark isn't just an old ruling house, they were central to the plans to defend Westeros against a return by the others from the start. That said, it would be wrong to imagine the Starks sitting in Winterfell Castle all that time, because as far as we can tell, when it was first built, Winterfell was not a castle. In fact, there's a very real chance that there was no overground structure at all. As with most castles in Westeros and in the real world, Winterfell has been added to and altered many times over the years as its population has grown and architectural styles have changed. But the oldest surviving structure is known as the First Keep. The name obviously implies that it was the first proper keep. This is what Bran was climbing when he spied Jaime and Cersei Lannister way back at the beginning of the story. However, as old as it is, even the First Keep appears not to be original. Its rounded architectural style shows that it is from after the Andal invasion of Westeros, so at least 2,000 years after Winterfell was apparently built, and there is no evidence of what, if anything, was there before the First Keep. Given the different ground levels of the castle, it was certainly not a large structure. The ground levels in Winterfell are fascinating, incidentally. The site wasn't levelled before construction to an alarming extent. You can enter one building on the first floor, cross a bridge and leave another on the third floor. The castle complex clearly wasn't all built at one time or with a master plan in mind, just adding bits piecemeal to fit onto what was already there over time. Which is obviously strange because the other things Bran the Builder apparently built, the wall, the high tower, Storm's End, if the rumours are true, have been incredibly robust, kept in place for millennia by strong magic, and haven't really been added to. So it's reasonable to conclude that what we understand to be Winterfell Castle today, the huge overground castle, is not what Bran the Builder spent his time building, and it's not what links the place to the Starks and to preparations for the return of the others. So if Bran the Builder didn't build a great castle at Winterfell, what did he build? He built what we now know as the Crypts of Winterfell. Our view of them is sometimes a bit clouded by what we saw on the TV show. Impressive, but limited. But in the books they are described as cavernous, bigger even than the expanse of the castle above, and descending many levels deep underground, the deepest of which are inaccessible from ages past. A mighty feat of engineering indeed, worthy of Bran the Builder. And there's something odd about these crypts. A few odd things, to be honest, but let's focus on the design for now. With most crypts, the oldest part is the closest to the surface. When an extra room is needed, another chamber is dug, and then another, with the newest being the furthest in or the deepest. But Winterfell's crypt seems to be the opposite way around. The kings of winter from millennia past are buried at the furthest, deepest part of the complex, with the more recent lords of Winterfell on the level closest to the surface. This is curious and hints at a sort of countdown. As more and more Stark generations are born, live and are buried, the closer to the surface we get, and there are now a lot of Starks buried there. If it is 8,000 years and there were, say, 20 years per generation of Starks, as a ballpark figure, that makes 400 or so Stark rulers, plus their families. That makes thousands. And to clear up a popular misunderstanding, all Starks can be buried there. Arya remembers Robb taking her and her siblings down there and showing them the tombs that would be theirs. It's just the statues that are only for the Kings of Winter and the Lords of Winterfell. That's the convention that Ned broke. Lyanna should definitely have been buried in the crypts, as should Brandon, but they probably shouldn't have had statues made of them and placed down there, despite a recent precedent. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There's a lot to be said about the statues, but I'll focus on that in a future video. For now, let's just note that the fact that all the Starks are buried in the crypt, the original Winterfell, is important. In some deep magical way, the Starks are connected to the crypt and have been for millennia. Many of them have dreams about it. Lyanna apparently made Ned promise to take her body hundreds of miles north to be buried there. Arya, Bran and Rickon all think about it many times and play there often. Even Ned, not a man to give in easily to superstition, could feel the eyes of the dead Starks on him when he was talking to King Robert there. They were all listening, he knew. In contrast, Theon and Jon, a secret Targaryen, remember, feel that it isn't a place for them. Robert Baratheon thinks of it as cold and dark. It's only a place for Starks. There, deep underground, more than anywhere else, is the spiritual home of the Starks, not the castle above ground. That is where the Starks belong, and no one else. At which point, it's worth taking a step back to remind ourselves of what the original site of Winterfell must therefore have looked like. A lone weirwood tree standing atop of a massive cave system that stretches deep underground with space for thousands of Starks to be buried over the years to come. In this context, it seems pretty clear that there must always be a Stark in Winterfell wasn't just about political power. They didn't rule all the north for millennia, or even to keep them in the castle, which wasn't even there at the time, but to ensure that the Starks would always be buried down in that crypt. The site was well chosen to allow the Starks to survive there even through the harshest of winters. Whoever picked the location wanted people to be able to stay there and guard the location regardless of the weather or climate. And the Starks definitely made best use of it. As the castle was built, the hot spring water that bubbled up to the ground nearby was piped through the walls to keep the main castle warm. They set up wells and fountains in courtyards outside the castle to keep the small folk, gathered from afar, alive in the harshest of winters, and even created a massive greenhouse called the Glass Garden to trap the heat in and allow them to grow vegetables all year round. The Starks could survive without ever relocating, and even magnanimously support their vassals in times of need. There was never a reason for them to move elsewhere. One other thing is worth noting about that original plan of catacombs beneath a weirwood tree. If it sounds familiar, that may be because it's very reminiscent of what we see and read about in Bloodraven's cave north of the wall. That also consisted of caves lined with the dead and forgotten in a hollow hill beneath a massive weirwood tree, which suggests that the plan for Winterfell was not just a human plan, but from the children of the forest and the weirwood trees themselves, which makes Winterfell much more than just stone walls. One of the most noticeable things about the first few chapters of Book 1 is how the language used to describe Winterfell is that of a living, organic being. The hot water is pumped around the castle like blood through veins, we're told. The air in the crypt is said to move up the stairwell in chill breaths. The castle is said to have grown like a monstrous stone tree, its roots sunk deep into the earth. The imagery is strong. Some book fans have suggested, and I tend to agree with them, that the final vision that Bran has through the weirwood tree of a sacrifice of someone probably also named Bran and probably also an ancestor of his, Bran the Builder perhaps, before the Winterfell weirwood, may have been sealing a pact of sorts, the magic that founded Winterfell. We don't have enough to go on yet to confirm that, but it makes sense that a ceremony and sacrifice like that did happen, tying the Starks to Winterfell. So, why must there always be a Stark in Winterfell? Yes, there are political reasons, and traditions can be strongly ingrained in a culture, but it seems that the original reason was to tie the Starks to that place, and in particular to ensure that the Starks were buried in that crypt generation after generation. There are obviously a number of questions that flow on from this. What were the terms of the pact? Why the Starks? And what happens when there isn't a Stark in Winterfell? I'll cover all of them in this series of videos, but that last one is probably one of the biggest bits of evidence we have on this topic. If "there must always be a Stark in Winterfell" is just a cool phrase, or tradition, or a clever political slogan, the answer is that when there are no Starks in Winterfell, nothing would happen. But if there is a magical reason why there must always be a Stark in Winterfell, then we should expect some magical consequence of there being no Stark in Winterfell. And of course, at the end of A Clash of Kings, when Bran and Rickon abandon Winterfell, there are no Starks there for the first time in perhaps millennia. What happens? Well, quite a lot that is perhaps not immediately obvious on a first read-through, and the language used to describe it, well, here's an example from Theon's POV as he returned to the Godswood some time later. It felt like some strange underworld, some timeless place between the worlds where the damned wandered mournfully for a time before finding their way down to whatever hell their sins had earned them. Are we all dead, then? He thought. That's pretty bleak, and not just an isolated passage. Bran's final thought as he looked back on Winterfell for the last time was that Winterfell was broken. And that's what we will look at next time. What magical impacts are there when there are no Starks in Winterfell? Because they are already having a huge impact on the story, and it seems that almost no characters in the story have even made the link yet. But what do you think? Why do you think there must always be a Stark in Winterfell? Let me know in the comments section below. For more videos in this series as I make them, there's a link to the playlist on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.